Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Finding Focus, Cultivating a County-Wide Vision for Inclusion, presented by Rachel Fauver, Director of School and District Support for the Santa Barbara Education Office, and Ray Avila, Executive Director of the Santa Barbara County SELPA. I'm Kevin Schaefer, Director of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this breakout session. First, a few logistics. This session will be recorded and archived on the conference agenda page after the conference for 1 month. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The interpretation icon in the same area will provide access to Spanish translation. We will ensure the ASL interpreters are highlighted along with the PowerPoint and presenters. Please ensure your volume is muted to avoid background distractions while the presenters speak. We encourage you to engage with others in the chat, and when possible, keep your camera on so we can see your faces. And with that, Rachel and Ray, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. And just wanting to ensure that everybody's in the right session titled Cultivating a Countywide Vision for Inclusion. And thank you for being here today. So as Kevin shared, Rachel and I are presenting, but we also want to give credit to our colleagues that work alongside of us with the Inclusion Network. And that would be Ellen Barger. She is the Associate Superintendent at Santa Barbara County Education Office for Curriculum and Instruction, as well as Tiffany Carson, who's also another director at SBCEO for School and District Support. And then my colleague with Santa Barbara County SELPA, Jennifer Connolly, who is our coordinator. So today's objectives are to help you understand the why, the how, the what, and what's next in terms of our Inclusion Network work. And let's start off with a video that will help frame our mindset for today's presentation.
One of the biggest myths out there, I feel, is that all disabled are mentally indeficient. Some of the kids with disabilities, like me, can't hide that. They're there for the whole world to see.
For a lot of people, when they see us with a disability, especially with a physical disability, they think we have limitations, right? And in some ways we do have limitations. For myself, I can do a few things better than a lot of people, and I can do a few things worse than a lot of people, right? Just like anyone else.
Well, like always thinking that people with disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, that they'll never be able to do what a regular person can do. Because that's the one thing that everybody's always dealt with throughout their whole lives. They've always had experiences where somebody's gonna tell you, oh, you're not good enough for this, you can't do that, you won't be able, you're not mentally able to do something. Right now, you see people in the disabled Olympics running with the mechanical feet, and they run 100 meters or even more sometimes.
I would say that another myth is people only without disabilities go to college.
Like, people don't think you could achieve it. Like, they'll just think you'll just not being on their own. I always wanted to go to college, but I've always heard that people with disabilities don't go to college. And like students like with me, like they didn't really seem to care like what like if you were going to go to college or not. They like praise more the AP students kind of.
In the second grade, I had a teacher who told me that I should be institutionalized because she thought I was never gonna make it. It was just gonna get harder and harder and harder. But my 3.57 GPA, I think it's proved that one out.
All right. So as we launch into today's presentation, we wanted to give you some just general information about Santa Barbara County. We're unique in terms of the school districts and charters that we serve. Fun fact, we have the second highest rate of homelessness in the state of California. So we have that juxtaposition of urban and rural. We have high poverty and yet high wealth. So it's definitely a county of the haves and the have-nots in terms of our demographics. The number of students identified as students with disabilities remains fairly evenly distributed throughout all our grade levels. The majority of our students who are identified is about 3/4 of our overall population, but that's fairly commensurate with our total enrollment. Looking down at the bottom box, the red box, I want to point out that 15.75% of our students meet or exceed standards for ELA, and this is our SWDs, compared to 50.98% for students without disabilities. And then for math, it's 12.26 compared to 37.71% for students without disabilities. And then for chronically absent, 32.9% of students with disabilities are chronically absent, compared to 19.9% for students without. And then finally, on suspension rates, we have a 6.9% suspension rate for students with disabilities compared to 3.3% for students without. And I'm going to turn this over to Rachel next.
Thanks, Ray. So we're gonna go over a bit sort of how we came to be where we are today, which is having what we're calling an inclusion network that has been serving our LEAs throughout our county, and start with some of our origin story and then get into a little bit some of the structures that we've used, a little bit of the content, and share with you all really what we've learned from this process, what we've found really valuable and important, and then where we are hoping to go in the future. So I think really starting with that video of raising up disability voices and some of the experiences or the ways that they have experienced education in the past is a place that really ignited us. And then we really had kind of two things happen sort of explicitly within our county that made us sort of come to the table and start talking about this as an area of focus a little bit more seriously. And the first was way back in 2017. Our teacher induction program did their teacher survey, as they always do. And they got some responses from their educational specialists who were going through the program that really kind of said, we have been instructed in our program that we just came out of that inclusion is the way to go. Inclusion. But we're having a big disconnect between that, what we were taught is the best practice, and what's actually happening in schools where we're now employed. And they were feeling discouraged and like they couldn't get any momentum in moving some of that forward. It was really all on them to kind of move it forward. And so that was one thing that really caught our eye. And then, of course, in the winter of 2018, we had our dashboard come out for our county. 7 of 10 districts had red somewhere on the dashboard for students with disabilities. And in that inaugural differentiated assistance season, all 5 of our LEAs that were eligible that year included the students with disabilities student group. So it was really, we sort of had these outside influences that brought us together to say, something is going on here that we feel like we need to respond to. And so, actually, I think, Ray, this one is yours, yeah? Yep.
So in establishing our team between the County Education Office and SELPA, what followed of what Rachel just shared is I came into my role as director in July of 2018 and immediately was being asked by our LEAs throughout the county and community members what's happening with inclusion. Inclusion was a primary focus a few years ago, and it seems to have fallen off the table. What's happening with inclusion? And then as I started collaborating with my county office colleagues, we had talks around inclusive efforts, what is happening, the work that they were seeing with what Rachel just shared, and all of a sudden we established our team. We were very intentional in our partnership and our collaborative efforts.
So in those really initial years, we spent a lot of time talking, and as Ray said, really being intentional about who we were seeking information from, what kind of partnerships we were developing, and we're really kind of trying to understand what was happening in our county. And as we were doing all this, kind of research and mining for information, we really landed in this place of saying, we don't necessarily have it all figured out right now. And many of our LEAs don't have it figured out right now. And I think maybe we're just in this season of inquiring, really asking some good and deep questions, spending some time wrestling with the current state of things in our county before we jump into this place of, okay, how are we going to do inclusion? And so as we started our outreach, and what we found, you'll hear this more than once, is that the outreach that we did, and the being very intentional about who we were looking to bring to the table to collaborate and to be a part of this network was really, really important. So we focused on distributed leadership as we looked to bring people into the fold. We did a lot of personal outreach, kind of our own personal channels, and then use some of the structures that we already had in place to recruit some participants. And this last one, this emphasis on shared responsibility. So we really tried to drive home that this opportunity wasn't the time for a superintendent or a principal to kind of look down the table at their special ed director or at an educational specialist sitting down the table and say, you go and figure out inclusion for us. That this really needed to come together as a team effort, and that a lot of the catalysts needed to start with just the general structures within the district or within the school to get things rolling. And so we had, in this first year in 2019, 2020, we had 3 meetings planned. And, as I said before, we weren't walking into this thinking we had all the answers. So we looked into our community to see who we might partner with and bring in to bring in some different experiences and understandings, things really kind of present things in a way that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And so we're very fortunate to have just in our backyard at UCSB, Dr. Rachel Lambert, who is an associate professor of mathematics and special education. And she came in, and that first meeting was really focused on kind of building the group as a team, really kind of building ourselves up as a group itself. And then Rachel was able to take us through a really great experience to understand the history of our sort of 2 segregated systems, so general ed on one side and special ed on the other. She also dove into this, the medical versus social model of disability. And at the time, the information and the experiences that group was having were very novel. There was a lot of new learning, kind of, layers being pulled back, curtains being pulled back that we just didn't even know were drawn before. And so we had some time then to actually consider where the remnants of that sort of historical system, the medical versus social model, are still existing in our system. So again, we're just kind of in this space of inquiring and thinking about the system that we are working in.
All right, so then we had day 2 of our 3-day session for 2019-20, and this was in February of 2020. And the importance of this meeting was bringing in disability voices, using those influences and new understandings to just tap into our personal whys of why we want to do this work in terms of inclusion. And so what we'd like to do now is share with you a video. This is Daniel Habib that you're going to see, and he's talking about the development of a shared vision for his son Samuel to experience a true belonging of the school where he attends. And we're going to take a few minutes to enjoy this.
We started wondering, what's his life going to be like in school, in the community, relationships, work, college? You know, how can he go to college when he can't even hold a pencil? How can he play with his friends when he can't just run outside? It was completely overwhelming. Over time, we finally came to terms with the fact that Samuel had a disability, and he would have a disability, a lifelong disability. So what do we do now? And what we realized we had to do was create a vision for Samuel and let him create a vision for himself. So what would that vision be? The vision that became obvious to us was that we needed to make sure that he felt like he belonged. That he belonged in our neighborhood, that he belonged in our community, and perhaps more than anything, that he belonged in his local school. Because how can you feel like you belong in your community if you don't feel like you belong in your own neighborhood school, which is the hub of the community? So that got us thinking about inclusion, because for him to go to his local school would mean they would have to work to include him. Now, luckily, Sam was a charmer. And a bit of a flirt. So in preschool, that wasn't that difficult, right? He was completely included in preschool. He belonged, no doubt. In elementary school, he was fully included in general education classrooms. He was supported, sometimes quite literally, by an expanding circle of friends. He belonged in that general education classroom, there was no doubt. He joined the Scouts. He acted in school theater. When other kids were speaking their lines, Samuel used the communication device mounted on his wheelchair to speak his lines. And that was normal. That's what he'd been doing all day long with his peers in school. For him, that stage was a place where he belonged.
So again, a shift of mindset from fixing Samuel to creating a vision for Samuel. All right, then we moved into day number 3 of our 3-day series for the 2019-20 school year. And the intent of this meeting was to reflect on the system we worked in, and if any, were there inclusive opportunities that were being implemented. Well, as we all know, March 2020, dun, 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 COVID came. And so the meeting that we had planned for May 2020, it became more of a therapy session for everyone involved, focusing on triage and support. And we were entering virtual learning and what needed to occur during those COVID times. So we had to sort of depart from our inclusion frame, but yet we were also able to talk about the dynamics that COVID brought to us that had us pivot, that actually did create spontaneous inclusive opportunities to ensure that our kids were engaged in their virtual learning.
Yeah, so, during, I'll say after 2020 and really up until the 21-22 school year, we sort of took a hiatus from gathering the way that we were. And, as Ray shared, we were much more focused on really kind of the triage and how to support our districts with, whatever they needed, as so many of us were. But what we found as we were kind of going through that process is that there kind of came out of it a new understanding for a lot of people about what it meant to be segregated, what it meant to be placed somewhere else, isolated, not feeling like we have a sense of belonging. And so we took some time to really think about, to talk about as a team, how we might sort of use some of those new insights that people were having as a result of having been through COVID and isolation. There was also this element of, as schools were bringing students back, we felt sort of a renewed interest in, do we have to come back and do things as they were? Or could we start thinking a little bit differently about the way that we're structuring our systems? And so we saw that window open for us within that space. And along with that was the re-release of the dashboard. And so again, we were seeing we had 10 LEAs eligible for DA. 8 of those included the Students with Disabilities group. Very common, throughout the state. We were seeing this overall. And so from that, we really, again, started engaging in those conversations and really talking about, like, okay, we want to restart this. What's it going to look like? What is going to get people to come back and re-engage in this work? And so we really felt like, the time of inquiry is kind of behind us. We're sort of done with that part. And we really want to move toward helping LEAs develop something of an action plan that both brought that understanding of what we mean by inclusion and what's our vision and all of that, alongside of some really sort of reasonable steps that they might take to start feeling like they were moving this ball forward. And so ultimately, we came to just drop the inquiry part and say, okay, we're going to re-engage and reignite the inclusion network. And so what you're seeing on this slide is really the premise on which we built the opportunities, the experiences, the resources that we were having our teams come together and experience. What I'll say too is that we didn't start here. This was it was a process to get to this place, and we got to, kind of this vision, this aim, along with support with some partners, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is really kind of where we're grounding our work, and it has really continued to be a place that, really anchors us in what we're doing, both the conditions we're creating and the intention of our time together. And so, again, we're going to stop and pause a little bit around this idea of outreach and engagement. And, particularly coming off of sort of those COVID years where there was just a general sense of people feeling kind of tapped, right? We were also in that space of, how do we get subs? How do we get people to re-engage? And so we tried to be really, really thoughtful about how we developed that outreach, collaboration, and partnership.
All right. So in moving forward, we discussed, what would be pivotal in influencing teams coming together for our future inclusion network meetings that we wanted to develop. So Ellen Barger, I mentioned her name earlier, our Associate Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction at the county office, and I attended in the spring of 2023 one of our monthly county superintendents council meetings. And this is when all the superintendents come together in one room and, of course, go over a variety of topics. And we were given the opportunity to present to them, just talking about a commitment to taking up the cause of inclusion, improving outcomes for students with disabilities countywide. I have to share with you that our superintendents were just so attentive and so enthralled in the message we were sharing with them, and inevitably overwhelming support from them to get this inclusion network moving forward. They saw this as a primary focus, and Ellen and I left that meeting knowing that we had 100% of their support. So then we also went to, in the fall of 2023, to Curriculum Council. This is a monthly meeting of countywide leaders here in Santa Barbara County. And we took them through an exercise that focused on the complexity of inclusive environments and also the urgency to move forward with our efforts in starting up an inclusion network series. And then we circled back with the Santa Barbara County superintendents at a fall superintendent council meeting, just to make sure we still had that support, and also to convey to them that we wanted them to put together a team from their school district or charter. It was important that they be part of messaging to their colleagues within their LEA the importance of putting this team together of special education, general education, administrators, and educators. And so that was that point in time. And then finally, behind the scenes, Rachel, myself, and our colleagues, both at the county office and at SELPA, started making personal phone calls and emails and just tapping into all of our leaders throughout the county, knowing that they now heard a message from their superintendent, confirming that, and then giving them support and assistance in building their teams and ensuring the attendance of our first network meeting. And then I had the opportunity to attend a state SELPA meeting right around the same time when we were doing all the planning for our 2023-24 network meetings. And Kevin Schaefer presented at this state SELPA meeting. And if you have not yet met Kevin Schaefer, this man is amazing. I saw him present. I had like this epiphany, and I'm like, yes, I knew that Kevin would be a great partner in our work and have a strong influence with his background knowledge. And so communicated out to Kevin, and he immediately responded with a yes, I want to be part of your team that's pushing forward this inclusion network in Santa Barbara County. And by the way, do you know I'm already working with this LEA and this LEA? And so the enthusiasm was there, and I just have to say we're very grateful that we have Kevin Schaefer as part of our team here in Santa Barbara County with the Inclusion Network. He's amazing. So we launched off the Inclusion Network. No more inquiring. We're done with that. We need to network and we need to move forward. And that was for this school year, the 2023-24 school year. Our participants included 12 out of our 20 districts. We also had 4 of our charter schools present. All of the LEAs sent teams, and we had over 90 participants on that first day. And if you've ever thrown any type of event, we were giddy, we were excited, and we were just so pleased with everybody's participation.
Okay, so that was how we really got ourselves moving again. And in this next section, we're going to talk a bit about the structures of the days, and then also some of the content that we brought into the days that really helped. I mean, really just kept people coming back, right? And engaged in between even the meetings. So as Ray said, we had the absolute gift of having Kevin Schaefer and SIP be a collaborator and a partner on this. And this framework is one that Kevin brought forward to us, and it fit so well into some of the work that we had started in the Inclusion Inquiry Network. We were really kind of looking at these different dimensions of system and where inclusion inclusive practices, where all of that lived within that. So when we saw this framework, we said, absolutely, yes, this is great. And it's the idea that, you need all three of these elements working together very intentionally toward inclusive practices or inclusion in order for the system to really gel and provide the support that's needed. And of course, at the middle is this shared leadership and vision. And so what we did was we said, okay, let's do one date per side of the triangle, starting with culture, because if we don't kind of address the culture that we're living in and we're operating in, we're not going to be able to change, any of the structures. It all just kind of wants to go right back. Moving into inclusive practices, and then finally landing on this idea of inclusive policies. And one of the things that we talked about with this idea of inclusive policy is not just sort of what we call the big P policy, those things that are written down somewhere. You can find them in a handbook or you can find them in board policy. We were also talking about the little p policies, those things that we say, well, that's how we have to do it that way. But nobody's ever really taken the time to inquire, like, do we actually have to do it that way? And who is that serving? And how does that move us forward, into inclusion? So we took a lot of, really kind of tried to think about how we were going to build these days together. So at the start of our first meeting, again, this is something that Kevin brought forward, these truths. And, just taking a moment to take these in and really think about what that means for us as individuals. If we hold these true, what does that mean for me as an individual? And also, if we hold these true, what does that mean for the system and the structure that I've been working in? So there was a lot of time for us to kind of wrestle with these ideas and where they lived and in the culture of our systems. So we, as we did here and as we talked about in the inclusion inquiry process, raising up disability voices, starting with that, having people kind of move around the room and really respond to some of the quotes that they were seeing together. And we considered allyship and meaningful belonging. And again, really kind of looking at that internal and external experience there. One of the things that we have here is the structure of our days together. And this was the same for all three of our days, for the most part. And that was that we would have kind of a morning time to really engage in content, have some deep conversations and experiences, some new ways of thinking about things, of exploring maybe some resources that we've seen before, but with a new lens. And in the afternoons, we reserved time for teams to really dig into their own conversations, to reflect on what they'd learned and experienced, and then do some planning, some thoughtful planning that was very, I'll say, carefully paced, so that we didn't try to jump all the way to the end of, and all students will be included without really addressing some really important elements. The other piece that was really important, what we found, was having some opportunity in between meetings for connection. And so we had ways of connecting with the participants either through, email, or we'll share with you in just a minute we had some documents that they were working on where we could provide some comments and feedback within them. So just these opportunities to kind of reconnect and re-engage and encourage them to dip back into what we had talked about, have some time to meet with their teams before they came back and came together with us at our next meeting.
So another amazing advocate for inclusion and universal design for learning, UDL, is Shelley Moore. She's got a quick wit and fun attitude that she brings into her messages, and I encourage everybody to look her up. She really is entertaining to say the least, but delivers a very strong message around inclusion. So presuming competence is a clip that we want to share with you right now. This just helped us look through the lens for considering culture and beliefs of the systems that we worked in, helped us to identify what we need to stop, and then also what we need to start in order to make shifts in our beliefs, cultures, and actions. So we give you Shelley now for the next couple minutes.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's episode is called Presuming Competence. Okay, so there's this barrier to inclusive education that exists everywhere. And the barrier is both the easiest and the hardest one to overcome. It's the easiest because it requires 0 resources. You don't need people or funding to overcome this barrier. But it's also one of the hardest ones because you can't force anyone what to think. There is no policy that can be put into place and no amount of funding that can make this change happen, because the barrier is mindset. One of the first responses I hear when advocating for inclusion is, yeah, but they can't. They can't read, they can't talk, they can't behave. And the best way to overcome this barrier is by presuming competence. Presuming competence is a term coined by Douglas Bicklin and emphasizes that everyone, even people with disabilities, can and in fact do learn all the time. And just because they're communicating their learning in a way that is different than how we do doesn't mean it's not happening. Presuming competence relies on some very important shifts in all of our thinking. First of all, we need to increase our understanding of what it means to know, because there's more than one way to know and to learn about the world. Second, we need to stop designing for deficit, which means we need to stop collecting and relying on data based only on what kids can't do or what they're not doing. Third, we need to understand that students do not need to prove their ability or show that they're ready to access learning, curriculum, or inclusion. Fourth, we need to understand that ability can take many forms and that everyone has strengths to build from. 5, thinking can be accessed and shared in many ways. And you know what? It can look unique to every student, not just those with disabilities. But you know what, my friends? Here's the bottom line. Presuming competence is simply believing and trusting that all students can learn and all students can get something out of any and all placements. Welcome to...
So as Shelley said, we just need to presume competence of all of our students, and this was a message that we discussed and digested at our network session.
So, there's a point at which all the talking and the video watching and all of that, you kind of sit back and go, okay, yes, I am in, but how do I start to move forward? Even in our first session, somebody raised their hand and they were like, but I'm feeling so overwhelmed right now, right? There's a lot to reckon with. Where do we go? How do we do this in a way where the overwhelm doesn't just stop it, sort of dead in its tracks, right? And so we based really that work on this results pyramid that comes from the culture partners. And it's this idea that culture lives in the experiences, beliefs, and actions that we take within a system, right? And that our systems are really perfectly designed to get the results that they are getting. So we kind of have to reckon with that a little bit, right? And if we never change the beliefs that people have, we're not going to change the actions that they have, and we're not going to change the results. So how do we change beliefs? And that really starts with what are the experiences that individuals need to have in order to start shaping their beliefs. right? We can't necessarily rely on just telling them, no, it's the right thing. We have to actually experience it. And so that was part of what that morning was having some of those experiences and really building into this place of identifying within their cultures, what do we want to stop and what do we want to start? And we really tried to keep it narrow for them in really just this element of culture to start with. And so what you'll see on the screen now is a template that we used. So every team had one of these templates and they were working on it. And we gave them the time and the support in that afternoon session to really dig into this and have some really deep conversations and an opportunity to kind of raise some of these things up. So they were looking at vision. And we gave them, we said, go on to your district or site vision. What does it say? Where does it live for you? How is inclusion connected to that? We had some data available for them that they could look into to say, where might be some spots that we need to kind of think about a little bit differently. We had them identify some results that they were really hoping to change, and then started going into some of those ideas of what's getting in the way, what might we need to shift and change. And so this template, and then some samples, I think we included 2 samples from our LEAs. So you can kind of see how they started to shape these conversations and ideas and content that we were sharing into the structure that not only captured what they were experiencing, but helped them to communicate back to others who maybe weren't in the room at the time, and also just gave them kind of an anchor to come back to each time we had them re-engage with this. So this became something that we went back to every time we met with them. And so as I said, in between day 1 and day 2, we had opportunity to go into those shifting the culture, as we called them, plans, give them some comments. We also reached out to them with some ways that they might be looking into some of their data and getting prepared to come back together with us. And so day 2, we really looked at our inclusive practices and this idea that, belonging or that inclusion really isn't just about physical space, right? It really, in order to be a truly inclusive and equitable environment, this element of belonging that Samuel's dad talked about in the video has to be present, right? So we took some time looking at this, the dimensions of belonging, and that should also be linked within the one-pager that we have. And looked at these elements, had some time to respond to those. And, ultimately came to this place where we said, okay, well, part of belonging is this element of having, not just being in the space, but having access to standards and the kind of instruction that happens for students who don't have IEPs. So we looked at some standards and we looked at this, a process for asking and answering questions about standards aligned IEPs, right? Sometimes the barrier is the way that we are writing IEPs. So we dug into that a bit and really had some opportunity to contemplate that on day 2. And then again, they went back into their plans and now with this added layer of practices, started reflecting and recording some of their conversations. The other thing that we did on day 2 was tapped on another statewide system of support provider for the System Improvement Leads Data Improvement Center. So we took some time for the LEAs to dig into this tool and to get at least as far as they could on the data drill down tool to get access to that. The idea being, if we're going to start setting goals, if we're going to be looking at results and figuring out where we're going, we really need to know where we are, and getting engaged with this tool to be able to monitor and not just wait for dashboard data or or even, you know, the special ed data that comes out in connection with SIM. This was, they loved it. They were super into it. And there was a lot of opportunity for us to support them in between. And I'll say the SIP team and the SIL team, you know, kind of in the background, being willing to come together, connect directly with our districts and those that were attempting to get into these, into this tool was fantastic. It was so helpful. So by the time they came back on day 3, they were all in, they had their access, and they were ready to go on this.
So then on the morning of day 3, we had a great activity that occurred that involved engagement and moving around of our teams. So we're looking at the California System of Support. And through the help of Kevin Schaefer and his colleague Janelle Mercado at SIP, we were able to share with our teams on day 3 all 9 of the support providers from SOS. So we had all 9 resource leads represented via Zoom, and we had these virtual rooms that our teams traveled to, and they had the opportunity to go to 3 different rooms through the course of the morning. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to do all 9, but the good news is all of the Zoom presentations were recorded, so our teams could go back and see any one of the resource lead agencies represented that they weren't able to attend in the audience. And then we had some in-person presentations as well. And we had time for questions and answers. And it was just a great morning of our teams learning about, wow, there is a huge system of support out there that we can tap into with just a plethora of resources that we can bring into our LEA in moving forward. And then also on day 3, we gave the teams the opportunity, as Rachel shared earlier, to examine their big P and little p policies. And we used the basics tool, which Kevin, of course, brought to our attention and allowed us to share. And it just gives us structure to examine the systems that we work within. And then what's next, the last tail end of moving forward. And we're going to share with you some feedback and some insights. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive and encouraging from the teams when we surveyed them. There was an emphasis on the benefit of time to be able to collaborate and process what they were learning, to be able to think as a team, you know, focused on their own system and where they were headed. We're currently developing the scope and sequence of the network sessions for our next school year, 2024-25. We will have a clear focus on incorporating UDL, Universal Design for Learning, considering implementation at a school or district-wide level. And then you can see some other areas that we will focus on in moving forward. And then Rachel's going to share what we've learned as facilitators.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we've taken some time, especially given that we started with the inquiry network and are now at this place of just, you know, inclusion network, to really reflect on what has worked and where some of the bumps have been. And I think this space of inquiry leading to action. I saw a question in the chat about, did inclusion classrooms start within this process? And what I'll say is, I don't think anybody necessarily started an inclusion classroom, but they were really taking the time to be thoughtful and plan and think about what those beliefs, needed to change, what sort of structures needed to change, how they could bring all of their staff along on this journey of understanding the perspectives and experiences of students with disability in their system before they sort of overhauled all of the classrooms and sort of, move students around without real understanding, without real engagement, not only of their teaching staff, but of their other educational partners as well, right? Their families. So it was I think there's this idea of kind of going slow to go fast. And what we were talking about is just taking sort of the +1. What's a place where we might leverage some opportunity to move the needle forward, so that we don't lose people along the way and get kind of stuck in that overwhelm. So inquiry as a part of that, then leading to action, I think was really important. This second bullet, I don't know that we can say this enough. Inclusion is not a problem for special education to solve. It's a systemic problem. It's one that leadership has to be just as involved in as, parents or family members sitting across the table at an IEP. So continuing to kind of bring that perspective and again, have those experiences so that people can actually walk away saying, here's how I know it's not just for special education staff to implement, right? That this is really about all of us coming together. It's a lens, it's a way of making decisions. It's a way of thinking about how we interact with each other, right? So again, as a part of that, demystifying, special education is not a place. It's not a place. We have these structures in our minds that point to rooms or spaces. How do we kind of pull that back and think very differently? I also saw a question in there about how do we get district office, superintendents, leadership behind this? What I'll say is we relied on, to a certain extent, data, right? Bringing that forward as a place of, this isn't, and not data of this is just your site or district, but this is a countywide thing that we really need to raise up and talk about. The other thing, Ray mentioned that we had an experience at our curriculum council. We did a polarity map of, sort of the complexity of that, of inclusion and, to include or to be out with working on specific skills, right? And we brought that forward to the superintendent so that they could see that their staff, their leaders were invested in this and had perspective on this that really was important, So again, thinking about those experiences, that ongoing connection and communication so that it doesn't just drop off and, they're coming in, they really weren't walking in cold to any of the meetings. They'd had an opportunity to interact. And just this idea of time, it takes time, stay the course, don't get discouraged, and, keep looking for those +1s that we can move forward. So where are we going with this? We are absolutely continuing with this. We're going to continue to collaborate with SIP and Kevin and are hoping to bring in some other system of support partners into this next year. We attempted a consultancy practice in April, and we learned there's overwhelm. There's too much with testing and, all kinds of things happening at this time of the year. So we're looking into next year. We want to be able to bring new LEAs on. And so we're doing a 1-day boot camp to kind of get them familiar with some of what you just saw today. And then we're going to resume into our process and again, do 3 days next year. To kind of continue to build and really get some feedback from them on what they're interested in. And as Ray said, the universal design for learning came up for everybody. And so we're really thinking about how to bring that in, not as, again, not as something that teachers need to implement, but how do we think about UDL as a system-wide lens, with that system-wide lens, or building into structures across the system, and not just about, giving students options for how they complete a task. So that's kind of our next area of focus. And with that, it looks like we have 4 minutes maybe for questions or comments from the group.
Rachel, there's a really great question from Mallory in the chat. How does belonging happen when there is not shared language or modality to foster relationships and direct engagement? Is it possible to be isolated within an environment that is labeled inclusive? And I think we talked about that a lot, like what is LRE and how does that relate to meaningful inclusive environments? And could they be the same thing, or could they be two separate ideas? So if you want to.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think exactly that, Kevin. We talked about it a lot, and I think that's one of those experiences that a lot of the people in the group could relate to, right? So yes, the student is in the classroom, but they've got an adult next to them all day, or they're being pulled into the back of the class doing something completely different, or the task that's in front of them is not at all connected to the content that the rest of the classroom is experiencing. And so we took some time, really. We had a resource for kind of examining some of the different experiences that students might have in an instructional setting that was very eye-opening, and that caused people to really kind of reflect on, you're right, I have seen this. And now that I've seen it and I've put it into these terms of belonging, and we talked a lot about, belonging also means contributing, right? Being a part of the environment where you're not only just in the space and even kind of being given the same information, but how are you actually contributing? How are you a contributing part of that environment? So it's one that the teams are certainly wrestling with and are thinking about within their systems.
And on those network days, they had time to discuss the reality that they could be working in inclusion silos, depending on what their role was. But because we had instructional leaders on the teams, they had these aha moments with each other, and were able to tease out, if there was an issue, and then take that back to their departments within their LEA and talk about, how can we improve the process where we're not in silos, we're working together with a common language. I did see, though, that I think Mallory was talking specifically about our DHH community.
Right, and a common modality, shared language, common modality to foster relationships. Yeah, I think it is, some of that is kind of context dependent, depending on what sorts of systems and even belief systems that you have in place, or structures for that access. I think there's always an opportunity for students to be contributing to an environment, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, right? And that it really comes down to having those conversations around, Mallory, just that experience that you are talking about. I think some of that goes back to this idea of, are we raising up the voices of those that are being impacted by this, and really thinking about it, not from well, what would be most convenient for the adults would be, and more from here's how, now that I know that a student is experiencing this, how can I continue to let this happen? And what do we as adults need to do in order to change this situation? So.
Well, thank you, Rachel and Ray. We're coming to a close. And thank you to everyone in attendance for your commitment to our students with disabilities and their families. It's our mission to accelerate our educational system to innovate, include, and impact outcomes positively for all, from birth to childhood and beyond. This presentation's slides and resources can be accessed in the session description section on the VFAIR's agenda page. If you have any additional questions, please head to the information booth. You may find your answer there. Be sure to join us for the sweet sounds of DJ B Diamond, lunch, and our closing keynote, Nicole Tucker-Smith, at 12:40. Also, connect with other attendees at the social lounge and stop to take a selfie in the photo booth. Don't forget to share on your socials and tag at SIP Inclusion with the hashtag SIPCon2024. So thanks again, Rachel and Ray. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and we will talk soon. Thanks, everyone.